Compressing the Bundesliga podcast. This is live. I'm Manu and he's Stefan Bienkowski. Stefan, how's it going on this Sunday evening, the tail end of Bundesliga matchday 3? How are you doing, bud?
Yeah, really well. Had a really relaxing Sunday. I mowed my lawn, which is very kind of boring suburban thing to do, but it's been being done for a while, and I was getting that kind of, I think that kind of anxiety that only men get, really, or maybe it's not. Don't want to cast assertions, but my wife just couldn't care less. I was like, no, I need to cut the lawn because all the other houses around here look nice, and ours. I don't know if it's because we just moved into this neighborhood like a year and a bit ago, and everyone around here is really nice and stuff, but like there's a lot of older people in this estate and they all take like the gardening very seriously, so I feel the pressure to at least keep the grass cut. So I finally got around to doing that, which was like a real sense of accomplishment for me. And but managed to fit some football in between as well, so yeah, pretty chill. It's also been raining. I got the grass cut just before it started raining, then I spent the rest of the day watching football, so I can't complain. How are
I
you?
will say the most North American thing ever, but I have a gardener.
Manu, we're the only people on our estate that don't I live in a cul-de-sac, and we're the only people who don't have a gardener. But that's also because we're the only people who are under the age of 70. So my own pride will allow me to get a gardener.
So it's only for the lawn. I have to say that too, and I've never had better edges. I can do it in 10 minutes.
Do you know what? We just had the first comment on the live stream, and it's an absolute doozy. For anyone who's listening to this as a podcast, like on their car or at home, we're recording this live on YouTube. And Daniel Gunther says, as a German, mowing the lawn on a Sunday is a big no-go.
It is really bad.
Is that the same all over Germany, Manu? Like, is it different in Bavaria? Is it
It
very
should be a
northern
shooting
German thing?
offense in Canada too. Just saying. This is a
Right.
country that does not like guns, but it should be a shooting offense to mow your lawn on a Sunday. That's the only day we don't have gardeners in this neighborhood.
It's you just do not get that in the UK. I get some of my neighbors have their grass cut like after 6 p.m. weekdays, and I've got a small child and it drives me up the wall, and I'm like, there must be some sort of law against this that you can cut your grass at a certain time, but we're really getting to the weeds of it now.
In German, there would be, and let's cut this to the football. You know who got the grass cut on Friday? Eintracht Frankfurt.
There we go.
Eintracht Frankfurt.
That's a really good segue there. Well done.
I had to do it. If we had started with Hamburg, it would have been even better, but we're not doing that game first, so it's Eintracht Frankfurt that's getting this treatment. I had really high hopes for them going into this game, and I really thought, they had a team that is flying so high, playing so well before the international break. And looking back at this game against Leverkusen, I think there's a couple things that went wrong here. First of all, we mentioned this in the previous show. This is the 11th game now in a row that they have lost in Leverkusen, right? This isn't a place that they like to come to begin with. They run into a new head coach. Leverkusen, of course, this is the first game by Kasper Hjulmand, who replaces someone who's managed to be deeply unpopular after just 3 competitive games. Then I think the other big thing, and I really think that this is probably what cost them the most, is that Christensen went off with an injury really early on. What was it, 10th minute? And from then on, that defensive line was just shambles. Teate had an absolute nightmare of a game. I don't think he was able to put 2 or 3 passes correctly throughout this entire match. And, time and time again, put the back line under a ton of pressure. Robin Koch, your favorite, also not with the best performance, but, the penalty that he gave away was also right after a Teate misplaced pass. Then Leverkusen had 2 guys sent off very late, the second one, right? Fisticuffs coming out, all that sort of stuff, lots of drama. And then you add to the fact that Grimaldo did not only score 1 but 2 perfect free kick goals. And you just kind of have to throw your hands off and just maybe think that if you're Eintracht Frankfurt, you cursed at that stadium.
Yeah, I think that's a very complimentary way of reading the chain of events, Manu, for Frank and Frankfurt's sake, which I'd expect nothing less of you since you are a Frankfurt fanboy these days. But no, I thought it was a really interesting game. As you said, I mean, I think I said this during the game or maybe afterwards. I think it's so interesting how expectation and kind of like narrative still have such a huge impact on football in the sense that going into this match, even though Leverkusen were the team who were the former German champions, finished the top four like what every season or the last like 10 or 11 or something like that, spent huge sums of money on new players in the summer. Despite all that, they went into this game as these kind of odd underdogs, and almost with a point to prove against a Frankfurt side who, had started the season really, really well, and are a very kind of likable up and coming club in German football. So we got to this point almost where there was an expectation on Frankfurt to go to the Bayern Arena and win this game quite convincingly. Everyone thought, well, Leverkusen are down and out. It should be an easy, like shooting fish in a barrel. And we did kind of talk about this a wee bit on the previous show, the sense that maybe Leverkusen go into this game thinking they might have a point to prove, or there's no expectation of them to win this game. And I thought for the most part, I thought Leverkusen actually played really, really well. I thought Hjulmand, the new head coach, obviously, who came in to replace Ten Hag, I think he got his tactics spot on. They played this kind of interesting, kind of quite defensive, counter-attacking football. But it was really simple, Manu. It was straightforward, quite direct at times. Get the ball up and over the back line. I thought Nathan Tella was a really great kind of out ball for much of the game for Leverkusen. And yeah, they obviously benefited from Grimaldo's kind of incredible set pieces. But I mean, we were talking about this in the chat with our subscribers on Substack. At times, Frankfurt couldn't even pass the ball out their own box. Leverkusen were just all over them. And it felt very much like the old Leverkusen. It felt like the team that, we'd seen over the last kind of two seasons. And the stark contrast between that and this kind of Frankenstein's monster thing that Ten Hag was trying to build, where, obviously I was at the previous game against Werder Bremen, and Leverkusen were trying to awkwardly play this kind of 4-3-3 system. Players were played out of position. No one really knew what they were doing. There was no real intensity to it. And, it just kind of felt like Leverkusen looked like their old selves to an extent, but also I think Hjulmand just did a really good job of simplifying things. And it allowed Leverkusen to kind of just play their own game and kind of get back into things. But I think there's something we have to definitely address here, and it is Frankfurt's record in these kind of big games. As you said, a series of unfortunate events definitely did play out to ensure all 3 points for Leverkusen. But I think you could argue that this seems to always happen when they play these big teams. I actually have Dino Topmüller's records against, I'm going to call them the top four. And by that, I mean Bayern, Dortmund, Leipzig, and Leverkusen. I know that's not a top four in terms of membership or historic titles or whatever, but let's just say it's the kind of de facto top four in recent days. And it's really quite appalling. They've lost 5 out of 5 games against Leverkusen. They've got just 2 wins out of 6 against Leipzig, 1 win out of 4 against Dortmund, 1 win out of 4 against Bayern. And last season, they picked up just 7 out of 24 points against those 4 clubs in the Bundesliga. And I can't really say, Manu, why that's the case, because I really do rate Dino Topmüller. I rate this Frankfurt side. It's definitely full of talent, but I'm not sure maybe if it's because they play a certain style of football that allows them to kind of steamroll teams in the mid-table or relegation teams, and then when they come up against teams like Leverkusen, and as we saw again on Friday night, there's an expectation of them to just continue playing that style of football. And even though Leverkusen are by no means the best team in German football right now, they still have some of the best players, and they were able to kind of pick to pick Frankfurt off on a player-by-player basis, I would say. So I thought it was a really fascinating game, both for Leverkusen, but obviously also for Frankfurt as well.
I mean, you look at all the metrics, right? Frankfurt outran Leverkusen. They played more passes. They had more passes arrive. They had more crosses. They had more dribbles. They had more possession. The area that really struggled was chance creation. Leverkusen had a higher XG, 211 to 0.65. But even when it comes to expected assists, it was 0.85 to 0.96 in Frankfurt's favor. Leverkusen had more shots on goal, 18 to 13. So you look at all these metrics and you're like, they did approach this game like a top team would against a lesser opponent, right? But for some odd reason, it didn't really result in goals and dominance. Now, having said all that, there were two unbelievable Grimaldo free kicks in this game. So like, how do you factor that? If that doesn't happen, the game ends 1-1. And there's not individual brilliance that's just lacking on one side over the other. Like, I mean, this is something that we also have to factor in here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to remember the last time Grimaldo scored a free kick like that. I'm sure he has scored a handful for Leverkusen, but to score two in that game was, I thought, even free kicks aside, I thought he was outstanding in this match. Even just having him as that left wing back, but also having Lucas Vazquez, by the way, who I thought actually played really well. Obviously, he's not Jeremy Frimpong, but he plays that right wing back role really confidently. And I was joking on the chat about saying everyone do a shot every time the commentator talks about Vasquez's vast experience, as a player, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot this season. But it is true. He's played against the best players in the world for the most part of his career at the very highest level, and you could tell he just was not fazed about playing Frankfurt. He was like, this is just my bread and butter. I'm happy to do it. So I think both of them gave that Leverkusen team so much confidence. And I don't know, Manu. I think it was the perfect start for Hjelmand, obviously, at Leverkusen. But I guess Topmoller maybe has to go back and do his homework and try and figure out why Frankfurt kind of come up short in these games.
I think the one thing I would say that I really did notice is that Bade, who had a fantastic debut in the Bundesliga, like how he ended up at a club like Leverkusen is mind-boggling, because like he's French national team player, right? Like signing him for the fee that they're paid for is unbelievable business. Kwanzaa and Tapsoba, the three of them were unbelievable in the back. Just absolutely outstanding. There was a few moments where Kwanzaa looked like he was going to eat his opponents alive. No, but it was unbelievable, like the workload that they put in. And when they were down a man and then down to two, you did not think that Frankfurt would get past them. And maybe that is just the difference. You had, without Christensen in the back there, you just lack a little bit of steel in Frankfurt's back line. And Nemanja Collins is an extremely talented player. I think he's a better right back than a center back. He plays center back in this game. Robin Koch, I think Robin Koch is a decent player, but he shouldn't be the main man in that back line. And he is, right? And I think that is maybe where the difference is, that, by all the talent that they have in this Frankfurt side, they did not go out and sign someone like Loic Bade. And that is to make the next step. You just need someone in there who can just anchor that back line and be this defensive rock, right? And I think maybe that is just a big difference here between them and the other top teams in the Bundesliga.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I actually thought most of those defenders played quite well in the Werder Bremen game. It was a match that I was actually writing a match report for the newsletter. I was writing a newsletter to put out at full time, and then I had to basically delete it in the 90th minute because of what happened. And it seems weird to say, because obviously they completely capitulated and conceded 3 goals. And it's weird to say, since they've now conceded 6 goals in the first 3 games. But I think on an individual basis, the players that they've picked up in defence are all outstanding. You're absolutely right. I think Tapsoba, pound for pound, is one of the best defenders that Leverkusen had last season. Maybe his, maybe he didn't have the most consistent performances last season, but in terms of actual quality, I actually think he's as good as Jonathan Tah, if not better, potentially as well, to be honest with you. Same alongside Hincapie as well. Kwanzaa, yeah, you're right. He's absolutely strolled through games since he joined. Baddies look great. Even Axel Tappe, who I thought played really, really well against Werder Bremen, he got pulled off and then things kind of fell apart. came on in this game and he just was absolutely flying. He can kind of play that wing back role and a centre back if you need to. But one of the main takeaways I took from this game, man, it was that for all of Leverkusen's problems, they absolutely do not miss Jonathan Tah. They do not miss Piero Hincapié. They might miss Hradecky if Flecken keeps making these bizarre kind of rushes out of the goal mouth. But I thought he had a better game in this match. But all the pieces are there, and this is kind of why I said in our previous show for the season, I said I expect Leverkusen to still get, you know, top four because I think all the pieces are definitely still there, and Yeoman's obviously done a good job of kind of putting them together and just letting them play, and it obviously proved to be enough. But in terms of Frankfurt, yeah, I think the other thing as well is, gosh, they're missing Kevin Trapp, aren't they?
Yeah, I do think Cetra is a good goalie. I'm not sure what's going on with this whole Kawa Santos hype train. They're seeing something that I don't, but people in Frankfurt get paid a lot of money. I do think Cetera is a good goalkeeper. Kevin Trapp was getting older and more injury prone, but sooner or later you had to do the succession planning there. And I think that Cetera had the numbers at Bremen, but I think it's also interesting, and we get to talk about Bremen later in the show. But they have now a really interesting goalkeeper, Mio Backhaus, right? Who they promoted, and that promotion was always kind of in the cards. It just went 1 year earlier because Cetera decided to go to Frankfurt, because Trapp decided to go to Paris FC. So the dominoes fell a little bit earlier than people thought it would. But I actually don't see a big problem in Frankfurt's goal until Koa Santos comes back, unless he proves me wrong. I'm a bit worried about that decision there. But yeah, I mean, Trapp brings a lot to the dressing room. That's the one thing too. He was the captain of the team. Now Robin Koch is the captain. Whether you make a defender like Koch, who shouldn't be the main man in that back line, also your captain is another question again. There's still lots there. And as I said, the underlying numbers, this game should have maybe gone a little bit better for Frankfurt. And until the very last moment when Grimaldo scored that second unbelievable free kick, it could have gone the other way. We don't want to necessarily say that this was like Leverkusen steamrolled Frankfurt. This was a 3-1. This felt like a 2-1 that could have also been a 1-1 or 2-2, right? Where Grimaldo had an unbelievable game of football. I mean, his best. And you hear his comments afterwards. You could definitely tell he was not a Ten Hag fan. It's not a coincidence that he speaks out afterwards and he has his best game under the new head coach. And I said ahead of the season that I think Leverkusen could be the flop of the season because of what's going on with Ten Hag. Now Ten Hag is gone. I actually think Leverkusen have one of the best coaches in German football at the moment. Right? So if Hjulman can recreate the vision and sort of team spirit that he managed to do with Denmark, this Leverkusen team, I don't know what the ceiling is.
Yeah, well, like we talked in the bonus show previewing this match day, one of the things I pointed out was the big difference between Yeoman and Ten Hag is who's very rigid with the style of football he wants to play, the formation he wants to play, the tactics he wants to play, while Yeoman very, very, diverse, very kind of flexible, and he's obviously came in and said, right, what's the best formation? Fits the players that I've got, and he very quickly came up with something very similar to they played on the Xabi Alonso, and it worked. But got some comments in the live chat. I did ask people what they thought of the game. Emmanuel Brown said surprising. Balham said eventful. And then Connor says Grimaldo had so much style. I expected to be so much more balanced. Yeah, those goal celebrations as well from Grimaldo were tremendous. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of golf, but we actually have a question here, Manu, which might actually lead us on to the second game quite nicely, because Baumann then asks, how badly do Hamburg need to win to help them in the Bundesliga, to help them get started? And that is next on our list. So should we jump into that game?
So Bayern HSV was everything we expected and more. And I don't mean this in a good way. We have a bunch of colleagues from our office in Hamburg, from Transfermarkt, who went to this game, and they posted pictures in the WhatsApp chat, in our WhatsApp group chat, And about 10 minutes in, I asked the question, what time do HSV kick off? And then answered it myself by saying every 5 minutes, which was answered by our colleagues by saying, well, at least the beer is good. And yeah, I guess that's true. When you go to Munich, the beer will be better. It didn't quite turn out to be every 5 minutes, but for a while it looked like it might. To be quite honest with you, I think the only reason this game ended 5-0 is because Bayern put the foot off the pedal. They said, look, this is bad. You're obviously not our level. 7 years have done nothing to you to teach you how you approach a game at the Allianz Arena. And we're going to let you live. We're not going to. I think if Thomas Müller would have been on the field, this game would have ended 8, 9, 10-0. Thomas Müller, of course, had his fun later that day in his MLS game, scoring 3 goals and making it 7-0. It was kind of felt like a reminder of what Bayern should have done with their opponent. You know, when you see Thomas Müller racking up the score in an MLS game and thinking like, okay, well, this is maybe what is missing. But I just thought of it that moment. Like if there was a Thomas Müller on that, he would have gone for 1 goal after another, right? And this game would have been 8, 9, 10-0. And I don't know if the gap is that big between Hamburg and Bayern that it would have been 10-0, but it's just the 7 years did nothing to eliminate those ghosts of these old HSV teams that went to the Allianz Arena just to get a thrashing, right? We spoke in the previous show the amount of goals that HSV have conceded, not just at the Allianz, but in Munich, period, even at the times when they were better, is mind-boggling. And I do think there's a dangerous moment here now for HSV into this season. They got their point against Gladbach. We get to talk about Gladbach. This 1 point against Gladbach where HSV looked good. When you look at what happened to Gladbach since, that 1 point that HSV got there, all of a sudden doesn't look as good anymore because Gladbach don't look good. So then they lose to their city rival St. Pauli, who look miles ahead of them at the moment in their development. And then they go to Munich, and the same thing happens again. And looking ahead now to who HSV have next week, they are back at home, and they're playing Heidenheim. That is a must-win game. Just to precursor this, we're not doing necessarily a pre-match show later this week because we have these 3 days of Champions League football, so we're doing 2 Champions League shows. But just to precursor it now, like Stefan, like after what happened at the Allianz Arena, and Heidenheim are one of those teams that are going to be in the relegation battle with them this entire season. This has now become a must-win game.
Yeah, I think Melon Poulsen was actually asked about this in his pre-match press conference when he said, do you have one eye on the Heidenheim game? And I think he got quite annoyed about it because, he obviously wants to focus on the Bayern game. And he says, we're not just there to kind of make up the numbers. We're obviously going to try and play. We're not going to sit deep and try and, just try and grind out a 0-0 win or grind 0-0 draw. Although it would have felt like a win for HSV after what happened. But no, I completely agree. If I'm being perfectly honest with you, I'm actually really worried about HSV. They obviously had a pretty active transfer window. Lost a few players that they relied on last season. I was at the club, obviously, a few weeks ago for the St. Pauli game, and someone at the club told me something quite interesting when they were discussing, their transfer activity. And I wrote a newsletter on like the kind of quest they're now setting off on to become a club that develop their own players and sell their own players and develop top class players to help them kind of get up the table as well, either through playing for the club or from making a lot of money from selling them. And one of the things that they said that they noticed is once they got promoted to the Bundesliga, suddenly all their players became twice as valuable. So the offers that they typically got in the second division had doubled overnight. And I think in a few cases they obviously felt an obligation to sell those players. And I think it has kind of come back to bite them because they're currently playing like a team, Manu, who have never played together. There's no chemistry. There's no cohesion. As I said, I was at the St. Pauli game and they got completely torn apart by St. Pauli throughout the match. And yeah, I guess a derby, anything can happen. All those old cliches, but St. Pally were just so well drilled. They knew how to express themselves on the ball, technically better, and like Hasval just were struggling to do the basics, and that was evident again in this game against Bayern. Now, I don't think a 5-0 defeat to Bayern in the Allianz Arena is really going to have a huge impact on Hasval's season, whether they stay up or go down. But I think we've now, as you said, we've seen them struggle against a really poor Gladbach side. We saw them get confidently beaten against St. Pauli, who we'll come on to talk about as well, who have been good, and now completely demolished against Bayern Munich. If they don't go out and put in some sort of performance against Heidenheim, then I think there's a real concern as to whether they actually have the squad or the head coach who can keep them in this division. Because it's setting off alarm bells. We're still early days, and obviously they're not just any old promoted club. They're a club who come up with a huge amount of expectation and history and tradition. Something I touched about in my newsletter as well, where their whole tifo ahead of the St. Pauli game was basically like, it wasn't exactly no one likes us and we don't care, but it was along those lines, in the sense that we know who we are, we're HSV, this is our city, blah blah blah. So you speak to people at the club and they're trying to be very modest and say, look, we have to walk before we can run, but there's still that huge expectation. And in this case, they expected to get thumped because they always get thumped off Bayern. But it'll be interesting. They're not just like a Heidenheim or something who can fly under the radar for half the season and then suddenly start picking up wins and then maybe scrape by at the end of May. If Hasval lose their first 5 or 7 games, it's national news. And I think that's a big difference. Got some comments, Manu, just from the live stream. I'm going to quickly throw them in there before I let you jump in. But Emmanuel, because I did ask what people thought, Emmanuel says it's unfortunate to see them lose, but at the same time, it's not surprising. Michael says, doesn't their backline have an average age of like 5 minutes? Probably. Torstein Vikan says, I think Hasval just need time. The issue is they don't have enough time to fix it. And then Connor says, I do remember being so impressed with their transfer window, though. Do you see it coming together? I guess that's the question, Manu, isn't it? Whether this team can come together in time.
So here's where I can issue some hope for HSV fans. St. Pauli last season, I have the schedule in front of me. They started the season with a 2-0 loss to Heidenheim. Then they lost 1-0 to Union Berlin. Then they lost 3-1 to Augsburg. Their first point came. It was a 0-0 draw against RB Leipzig. And then on matchday 4, they finally got their first win, which was a 3-0 win against Freiburg. But then they lost 2 more times against Mainz and Dortmund. And then the results slowly started coming in. Here's where I have the negative. And, maybe timing-wise, it was a little bit better for St. Pauli. But St. Pauli had Bayern Munich at home, right, on match day 10. And that result was only a 1-0 loss. So, they were defensively much more coherent. And, Blessing too, he was in a difficult situation. He came in to replace Hürzeler. It was a thrown together squad. There wasn't much experience there. I remember we had a lot of the same discussions about St. Pauli last year than we have about HSV right now. And I know HSV and St. Pauli fans probably just love the fact that we're comparing them here. What I'm trying to say is that if you're a promoted side, it's not always as easy as 1. FC Köln, who come into the season and, I have 7 points and probably should have 9. We've been absolutely phenomenal and playing incredible football. It's worth visiting and discussing probably at some point soon what Köln are putting together there. But, I think, and this is maybe the big difference too. Köln have had this experience of going up and down and the roller coaster, and everything is hyper emotional in Cologne anyway. So you can't take it serious when it's really good, and you can't take it serious when it's really bad. HSV, they're still a patient on life control, right? They're slowly waking up from the 7-year coma, but you're still kind of in this really fragile state. Like, is the patient strong enough to come out of this coma and wake up and be healthy, and can the body survive this? So this season really is, those first few days after a 7-year coma where the patient is still very much under like observation, and every tiny little thing will be put under the microscope at the moment, right? Because it isn't like Köln will go up and down all the time. Yeah, it's just a different thing. They were gone for so long, and that means that the entire environment, the entire club, have to relearn what it is like to be in the Bundesliga. There's 7-year-old kids out there who don't know that HSV were once the dinosaur of the Bundesliga, right? So all I'm saying is that this is the equivalent of Heidenheim going up a few years ago, or Darmstadt, right? Teams that have been gone for a long time, and I think that is something that has to be kept in mind here. And the problem, of course, is that they themselves don't see it that way, right?
Yeah.
So the learning is a lot harder in that case. And as you said, it's national news. This is the second biggest city in Germany. It's one of the largest metropolitan areas. A lot of the newspapers are based there.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of circus that Bayern Munich face all the time. And so
Yeah.
that is hard. It is really, really hard.
Yeah. Fëanor, which I hope is a reference to the Silmarillion, says the only thing I want for St. Pauli is for them to disappear back to the lower divisions. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And I mean, I think you're right to kind of reference St. Pauli and kind of say they had a difficult start. The only difference is for St. Pauli, they didn't really have any expectations coming into the league. They had a new head coach who was replacing the guy who got them promoted. They lost a few players. So I think everyone kind of expected St. Pauli to kind of make up the numbers and then maybe go back down, have some fun, great fans. It's great to have them in the Bundesliga, but they'll be back to where they belong, and they've actually blown that expectation out the window. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Manu. And I think the other interesting thing that's worth keeping an eye on, and I hope this doesn't come because I think he's a good young head coach. It's great to have head coaches in there, but if things don't come together, the pressure on the Hausfall head coach, obviously Merlin Poulsen, is going to be intense, and it's going to be really quick because we're talking about a guy here who obviously did really well last season with Hausfall, but before that, under 18 coach at Hausfall, before that, Osnabrück, I think he was. He has no he's got no experience at this level at all, and I'm hoping that's not an issue. I'm hoping he thrives, and we've got an exciting new head coach in the Bundesliga. But if it doesn't, that'll be one of the first kind of excuses that gets kind of wheeled out. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's no experience in the Bundesliga. He can't get the best of his players. Blah 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 blah. And that's when they kind of got on the phone to, Bruno Labbadia or something like that, and then the whole thing starts to fall apart. But I'm just saying it's worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I mean, Bayern Munich, of course, for them, this was the perfect opponent ahead of Chelsea. They were able to as I mentioned, from the 20, 30th minute onwards to basically rest players and rotate at halftime. Serge Gnabry, who had an excellent game, comes off. Nicholas Jackson comes on, makes his debut. Dayot Upamecano comes off. He's replaced by Rafael Guerrero. By the way, Rafael Guerrero then has to come off for Tom Bischoff because he picks up an injury, which is a friendly reminder how thin that squad is. Right.
Daniel Günther says Ten Hag is available if they do.
We'll get to Ten Hag in a moment here because I think there's another club that might need a coach.
Oh boy!
But it's going to be a really interesting game. I think the one point of criticism I had here for Vincent Kompany is Tim Bischoff and Leonard Carl probably come on a little bit too late in this game. You have like a 19-year-old who needs game time. Great. I think it's fantastic that Pavlovic is the guy who's finally getting a start, and Leon Goretzka sits the entire game. And I thought Pavlovic was fantastic. Scores a goal as well, right? He's the future of this club. Him and Jamal Musiala and Alphonso Davies, they're a big part of the future of this club. And I suspect Tom Bischoff will be too. And I actually think Leonard Carl will be too. He looked fantastic in these games, but this would have been a great opportunity to play him 45 minutes.
Yeah, we had a lot of Bayern fans in the chat, didn't we? In the subscriber chat and Substack, decrying the fact that we didn't see that. And it's a fair point. It's going to be a long old season, and these are the kind of games where you think Bayern or company maybe has to be a bit more flexible. We touched on that at the end of last season. We obviously talked about when we picking our coaches of the season and the pros and cons to a lot of these guys. And I think one of the things we talked about with Company is that in his first season, he kind of had that excuse of saying, I just need to win, I need to go over the line, have to win this trophy, prove that I can do it. If I need to do that with a 48-year-old in goals and, Harry Kane with one leg or whatever it is, then fine. But yeah, this season against the Haas-Fouls of this world, with all due respect, that's when you would kind of hope to see some other players getting some serious game time. But it worked, and all due respect to Bayern, they have done really well to such an extent that I actually had a Dortmund fan reach out to me on Blue Sky, basically decrying the fact that Bayern have been absolutely spanking teams recently in the Bundesliga and saying season's over, typically done. And I had to basically talk him back from the edge. I was like, you're being a real typical Dortmund fan here, saying that Bayern have already won the title before they have.
I know we don't have them on our running order, so I'm going to keep this really brief. I watched the Dortmund game on Saturday, and I thought...
We actually had someone ask why we're not talking about the Dortmund game, so there we go. Let me see who it was. I think it was Tor saying, on what globe do we live on where Dortmund have a pretty eventful or uneventful 2-0 win away from home? That's not normal.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it should be. This should be the standard, but I thought they were fantastic. That result was never in doubt. This should have been higher. Guirassy, super efficient. The only thing that bothered me about this, and this gets back to your Dortmund friend, is Maxi Bayer said, yes, we want to win the title, and then Niko Kovac basically saying, oh, I have to talk to him afterwards because, we don't want to set these sort of expectations. We were 13 points behind Leverkusen and 24 points behind Bayern Munich last season. It's like, come on, give me a break. You're obviously the second best team in German football, and you have a legitimate shot of catching this Bayern Munich team if they slip up. You do. Even the St. Pauli result where they threw away the result, but that is a game that I think 9 out of 10 times they win. I thought they looked fantastic in the other 2 match days, and this Dortmund team has a very big chance of winning the Bundesliga title this year. And I just wish Dortmund officials to actually say that rather than trying to not say it. But I guess it feeds into the fan expectation as well. So there we are.
Yeah, well, to bring it back to Bayern, I completely agree with you. I thought Dortmund were really impressive when I saw them against Union Berlin. And, we talked about them back then as well. But yeah, you're right. It guess it speaks to Kovac that a 2-0 win away to Hoffenheim is kind of just seen as quite standard. It certainly wasn't standard under his predecessor, especially away games for sure. But having said all that, talking to his Dortmund fan on Blue Sky, because I was saying, well, look, let's just wait and see what happens when Bayern play a decent team, because with all due respect, they haven't really played any decent teams yet. And even Augsburg, who haven't been great, gave them a bit of a run for their money in that 3-2 win. I expect Dortmund to give them a very good game. I expect even Leverkusen to give them a good game. And we've still got your Frankfurts, your Freiburgs, your even your Leipzigs maybe of this world. Leipzig were obviously better this weekend as well. So I think, this is even to focusing on individual players like Serge Gnabry, for example, who's had a stellar start to the season, even with Germany. I'm really intrigued to see how long that lasts, because Gnabry in particular strikes me as a player who has these real kind of hot flashes of form, and then they can just completely go out the window at times. Obviously, they've got Champions League games coming up, so that will obviously be a completely different thing. But I'm really intrigued to see how they do against tougher opposition. But with all due respect to Bayern, they can only beat the teams that are in front of them, and for the most part, they've done exactly that. And in typical fashion, Haas-Foul. This is a club, by the way, who got thumped so hard off Bayern, they once had to put on a barbecue outside the stadium to say sorry to their fans. So, Haas-Foul are absolutely not a good barometer to judge how good this Bayern team are. But
and also not this time of the season. I remember Bayern Munich seasons where they had 8-9 wins to start the season and still didn't win the title. This is so early. Just relax, okay? It's match day 3. Yeah, I think I'm really curious to see what's going to happen once they have the Champions League games, which of course, Tuesday, Chelsea.
Yeah,
going to be really interesting.
Can I jump in before we go to the next game? Just jump in with some people in the chat. Michael says, "Isn't Labadia the Sam Allardyce of German soccer?" Yes, he is. Feanor says Ruben Amorim might also be available soon. Michael says Leonard Carl has the makings of a wonderful player. I think we completely agree with that. And Gunther says Dortmund say this since probably 2013. Heidenheim were dreadful. It's a Dortmund trauma response. And yeah, they say that, the Champions League game will probably decide the title. Anyway, they're all now talking about Eric Ten Hag and Ruben Amorim, so I guess we probably can move on, Manu, to get back to the German football.
We'll get to Eric Ten Hag, I promise. And whether his Düsseldorf residence might still be useful. Let's talk about St. Pauli. First win from coming from behind in the Bundesliga in 14 years.
Also, their first win in Gladbach in 15 years, I think.
In Augsburg?
Sorry, apologies, yeah.
Yes, no, that's Bremen, who we get to talk about.
Sorry, yeah, I'm actually completely confused. It's Bremen, who I think first 15. Yeah, my apologies, completely well off there.
Wrong fish heads, Stefan, as I would say as a Bavarian. Wrong fish heads. In Bavaria, we call everyone north of the Danube Fischköpfe, so fish heads. We get to talk about Bremen in a moment. Yeah, St. Pauli on 7 points after 3 games. Them, Köln, and Dortmund, the three teams chasing Bayern Munich this early on in the season. St. Pauli, you said feels like a big result. I fully agree. I think this is to have 7 points at this time of the season for a club like St. Pauli who aim to have 40 as quickly as possible feels like a big deal. They're 6 points clear of a relegation spot, which is the number one thing that they would say, but they also took off points Augsburg, who are still in this grand experiment with Sandro Wagner. And we mentioned how they look good against Bayern Munich. They have their 3 points, but it's it does feel significant that in a game like that Blessing significantly outcoached Sandro Wagner here. Felt like a learning experience.
Yeah, and that's kind of becoming a very kind of obvious habit or trend, if you want. We're not just seeing the St. Pauli team here who are, feisty, or not a team that are hard to beat. They're not a team who are plucky. They're a team they're a legitimately good footballing team who know how to play around other teams around them in the table. They did that against HSV on the last match day, and they did it against Augsburg, even though Augsburg obviously gave them a bit of a run for their money. I've been so impressed with this team. I think that midfield of Sands, the US men's national team player, Fujita, the player who they signed in the summer, he was really impressive against HSV. I thought he was okay in this game as well. There's probably about 3 or 4 players in that team, I think, that played against Augsburg who came in the summer, which is a huge benefit to St. Pauli as well. And yeah, I just think it's fantastic, man. Like I said after the HSV game, I can't remember where I wrote it, but I wrote an article for World Soccer magazine, and I think I maybe mentioned it now, or maybe I mentioned it on the show. I was actually speaking to Matt Ford, who's obviously of this podcast, who was sitting beside me during the Hamburg derby, and I think I said to him that it feels very much like, we just talked about Hamburg and their struggles, and then you mentioned St. Pauli had similar struggles, and Blessing obviously came in and basically just had to inherit the squad and find a way to keep them in the Bundesliga. And it felt very much like in that season they played very kind of pragmatic, sometimes defensive football. Wasn't always pretty to watch. But this season it very much feels like Blessing's kind of getting the style of football that he wants to play. And we've talked about him quite a lot on this show and talked about, where he comes from and his history as a head coach. And I mentioned, I think it's quite interesting that the club that he was at before St. Pauli, Union Saint-Gilloise in Belgium, a team who are very used to dominating their league. He's used to playing, attacking, dominant football. He wants his teams to take the ball. He wants his team to control the game. He wants to control possession. That's what he's used to as a head coach. You could argue he even did it at Genoa in Serie B with them. You could say he did the same at Ostend and same in Belgium as well to a large extent, where he got them to like 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, or 5th. So even though he's at a club in St. Pauli, who obviously have one of the smallest budgets in the Bundesliga, his history as a head coach is as someone who's typically in charge of better clubs who are used to kind of winning games. And I think it's so interesting that we're seeing that influence kind of creep in to St. Pauli's style of football, Manu.
No, absolutely. And they brought in the players to make it work, right? You mentioned Sands, who played that sort of dominant football in the New York City, like in the Manchester City, the City Group system, right? Because he's a New York City FC product, and went to Europe, went to Rangers, didn't quite work out there. Went back to New York City FC, and now it's St. Pauli, and I think plays in a role there that's perfect for him. And now with Fujita, who's a lot more dynamic, I think, and a lot more forward thinking, and a lot more kind of the box to box player, that pairing really works. And I feel like slowly but surely Blessing gets to, because he inherited a little bit of the team last year, right? And kind of Hutzela was part of the preseason kind of build up of that, and then he like left so quickly for Brighton, and it had to be done really quickly. So now you kind of can see that this is the style he wants to play. It's that 3-4-1-2. It's that really dynamic football. He thinks the game really well, and we've seen this. We've seen St. Pauli really have an identity now, and I guess it does feel significant in a way, because if St. Pauli stay in the league again, I think that would be the longest run in the Bundesliga. It would be 3 seasons in a row, right? I think they've done 2, and that's the max. Who knows where it ends? We see it in Berlin, where Union has now become the number 1 club in the city, right? Because of the sustained run in the first division, and being sort of this like counterweight to Hertha Berlin, and it's kind of, I do find that development very fascinating. When we had someone suggest earlier that St. Pauli will disappear again in the lower divisions, I wouldn't put money on that.
Yeah, we actually have a St. Pauli fan in the group chat actually who says, asked him what he thought of the game. He said, Huntonji gave me a migraine. Glad Blessing wasn't taken in by the penalty and subbed him out at the half. Opi, Pairika, the 2 wing backs, also had some growing pains. Curious to see what you guys think they'll do with Chaco now that Sans, Fujita have been so good. I was actually about to mention this, and I think you made a really good point actually about how Blessing's really kind of beginning to get his own kind of style in this team. We also had Tor saying Stuttgart St. Pauli next week. Hope he tells a lot about both teams. If St. Pauli beats Stuttgart, does that mean alarm bells ring for Stuttgart? It's an interesting point, which we can probably get to in a minute. But to go back to Kilzig's point, I think that's actually a really good point. Irvin Jackson, obviously a huge player for St. Pauli, hasn't even really played yet because he's been injured. He was back in this on the bench in this game. I don't think he came on, if I'm not mistaken. But I think that even just goes to show how much this team has changed in the last kind of 3 or 4 months. In the sense that we've now basically got this entirely new midfield. Interesting enough, I was with the guys from the Cooligan podcast when they spoke to James Sands in the mix zone after the match, and they were asking him all sorts of questions about the US men's national team and stuff like that, and he then kind of came over and spoke to us, and I actually asked him how this kind of style of football maybe suits him, and he says, because obviously he didn't work out at Rangers, and I don't know about his history at MLS, man, and maybe you can also talk about that, but he said this really intense, quick 1-2 passing. Everyone's kind of expected to have the technical ability to make those quick 1-2 transition passes. He says that's the kind of system that really suits him, and he just loves playing in it. So it definitely feels like St. Pauli are now they're very much now Blessing's team. They know how to play under his style of football. As Kilsig said, there's still a lot of kind of growing pains. I completely agree with him on Ope. I've got huge hopes for Ope, obviously based on how he did last season. But he's not maybe been as impressive in these first 2 or 3 games as he was obviously last season. Understandably, he's had to make a huge step up. But yeah, I think the sky's the limit for St. Pauli, Manu, because not only have they had to bring in a lot of new players who are still learning how to play for them, but they're still picking up points and doing very well. So long may it continue, unless you're a HSV fan.
Yeah, unless you're a HSV fan. I'm sorry to the HSV fan in this chat. I don't see St. Pauli go anywhere anytime soon. It will continue. And Oppi picking up, it was of course very, very, he played a very similar system with Arminia Bielefeld last year. right?
Yeah.
The Bielefeld side, by the way, could get promoted again. They started on fire in the Zweite Bundesliga. And so, like you see, like they also picked up players that work for Blessing very well. Picking up a player like, I forgot the name of the coach at Arminia Bielefeld, who plays a very similar system with the club. And so, they obviously identified the right people for the system. So yeah, great stuff. All right, let's talk about our final game here to wrap this up.
Mitch Nyat.
Mitch Nyat, who, by the way, I think one of the best coaches to emerge in German football over the next few years. That Arminia Bielefeld team is very good, and they played incredible football, of course, to get to the Zweite Bundesliga. They're currently third in the Zweite Bundesliga as a promoted team. Yeah, watch out. I think they're very good. And if you have emerged from his kind of coaching school like Oppi did, I think you're going to do well in the Bundesliga. All right. There's of course, some parallels from James Sands to this next club that we're going to talk to. There's two of his former teammates, New York City FC teammates, who play for Borussia Mönchengladbach. Only one of them played today, as Gio Reyna made his debut for Gladbach. Joe Scally not in the side. Wow, I don't think it couldn't gotten any worse for
Poor
Gladbach.
Gio Reyna, by the way. Poor Gio Reyna. The guy just keeps hopping out the pan into the fire, doesn't he, with his career? Off on loan to Nottingham Forest, did nothing now.
Yeah.
Tasked with digging Gladbach out of ruin, single-handedly, it would seem. But yeah, we should probably tee this one up. I mean, should we quickly talk about how good Werder Bremen are, Manu, before we, probably
Oh
spend
my
the rest of
God.
the show talking about Gladbach?
I saw we did this big preview show where we rated clubs transfers. And we did it, of course, before the final week of the transfer window, where Werder Bremen did all the right things. It seemed, from our terrible grading to really improving this side. Sugawara, fantastic pickup. Puentes, Puertas, sorry, looked really good today as well. Of course, Boniface comes in on loan. Um, I also really liked young defender Karim Koulibaly, 18 years old, German center back, Mio Backhaus, goalkeeper, 21-year-old goalkeeper, looked really good as well. Horst Steffen was brought in to work with young players. And I pointed this out in that big show that we did as well. I thought the right coach. I'm a big Horst Steffen fan. I covered Elversberg a little bit at the tail end of last season when they almost got promoted to the Bundesliga. The amount of players that he's graduated, Aslani, for example, had a fantastic game for Hoffenheim on the weekend, right? He worked under Horst Steffen. There's a certain Woltemade who scored for Newcastle this weekend, 75 million euro signing. You may have heard of him. He worked with Horst Steffen at Elversberg. Like, this guy knows a little bit about football and about working with talents. And my worry was that Bremen didn't give him the squad. I feel a bit better about Bremen now. I feel better because they made the right additions at the end of the season, and I think there is now young players coming in, and his style of football is so much fun to watch, Stefan. I mean, Gladbach were crap, but Bremen looked incredible good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm not mistaken. They had 3 or 4 players from the youth academy in their last game against Leverkusen. I'm just quickly checking on this
I
really cool
think they
website
did in
they've got.
this one too. Backhaus, Koulibaly, Kovac. Um,
Yeah, they've got 8 players apparently in the team, in the squad from the youth academy. 4 of them have already played. Kovic, Koulibaly, Backhouse, the goalkeeper, as you said, and Keki top, the centre forward.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if he's actually played yet this season, but no, I completely agree with you. I think Bremen were impressed against Leverkusen for the most part. Leverkusen just kind of got a wee bit lucky. Friedel, I think, not Friedel, sorry, who got sent off in the last game. Stark, sorry, got sent off, and then kind of gave Leverkusen a penalty, which kind of killed that game, and then did really well to come back into it. But no, they've got a pretty decent blend, man, I would say, of kind of older players, in terms of the older players. And I mean, I guess not a good time to mention Stark because he got sent off the last match, but he's obviously very good in that regard as an older player. Stay as well in the middle of the park as well. The Danish midfielder is a great player as well. But you're right, a real good injection of young players. Sugawara, the player they picked up in the summer, has been really, really impressive at right back.
I like him a lot.
And yeah, it's just a really nice kind of blend of youth and experience, and they're doing really, really well. In that regard as well, I was just so impressed with them against Leverkusen in terms of the way the crowd got behind them. But first win of the season against a decent Gladbach side. Sorry, not a good Gladbach side. They got a point against a decent Leverkusen side last weekend. And yeah, I kind of hope that they would, because they've obviously feel like they've got the club feel like they have a point to prove in sacking Ole Werner. Because it was such a kind of ordeal about whether they should keep him, whether they should let him go. That Voldemada free transfer still hangs over that club so much. And they're desperate to move on from it with kind of developing their own players. And they've also brought a head coach in who's more than happy to do that. And frankly, there's very few things better in football than watching a team full of young players do very well, very well. But yeah, it's and as Tor points out, Bremen still have a lot of injuries. He's absolutely right. They're still missing a huge number of players, which is why they kind of did that kind of. They got a lot of grief in the summer for the kind of number of loan transfers that they made. And I was in an interview with Klaus Filbry, the CEO of the club, which did a piece on the Gegenpressing newsletter for. He was asked about that. I actually asked him about that. I said, it's a bit of an elephant in the room here. We have to talk about that kind of weird summer transfer window. And he said, look, we had to address some issues in the squad, but also we had 3 or 4 crazy injuries. Like they said, one of the injuries was due to the fact that one of the guys got an x-ray and he found like a bit of bone just detached in his hip that they had to replace. One of the guys kicked a goalpost in training by accident, broke his toe. I can't remember which one it is, but he said basically he just had a series of really weird injuries. They don't want to sign players to replace players who are injured because they could be coming back, but and that's why they obviously got in loan signings, and then they obviously picked up Victor Boniface last minute, which was quite a surprise. But he came on, got an assist, Manu. So everything seems to be going quite well for Werder Bremen, and it'll be interesting to see what they can do. But I'm not sure if I'm too worried about them. I mean, we're still super early in the season, and a lot can change. But looking around that league table, Manu, and some of the clubs that we've talked about on the show tonight, but elsewhere as well. There are a lot of teams who look like they're going to really struggle this season. And, if it's 4 or 5 of them and Werder Bremen can stay above them, then I think that's a perfectly good season for them. And actually, Klaus Filbry said to me that they've accepted that they might not pick up the same number of points as they did last season under Ole Werner, but the idea is that they build this squad of young players so they can hopefully do even better in the years to come, which I appreciate is exactly something a chairman or a CEO would say. But I think, to be fair, they're putting their money where their mouth is in that regard by playing a lot of young players.
Yeah, and I mean, if the strategy works, then that's fair play. I mean, Bremen was always a club that did develop big name players or picked up players that then made the next step. I think of someone like going all the way back, Rudi Völler, Miroslav Klose, Mesut Özil, who they picked up from the Schalke Academy and then really had his big years there. Diego, these players came young and were sold for lots of money afterwards. And I guess they kind of want to rediscover that path. To make that transition, like Mbangulo, of course, is a good example maybe of that. But yeah, to make that transition to Gladbach and what's going to happen there. We made a lot of Erik ten Hag jokes on the show already. And the reason why we made these jokes is because there is question marks now over Gerardo Seoane's future. And Erik ten Hag, probably like most players and coaches that either play for Köln, Düsseldorf, Leverkusen, and Gladbach, have one thing in common. They all live in Düsseldorf. Every single one of them. And I'm pretty sure Erik ten Hag still has his Düsseldorf address ready. So, like it was with Seoane, who came in, after this Leverkusen gig. Maybe that's what's going to happen here next. But all jokes aside, sporting director or director of sport Mirko's saying he's going to sleep a night over what happened in this game, and that's always a bad sign. I think if you're a head coach. I spoke to some sources last year about this. They know there was moments where Seoane was almost gone last year, and then he turned it around. I'm not sure the confidence is still there this time.
Yeah, it's really tough one for Gladbach, and I think they're in a kind of tricky situation where it's hard to tell whether it's the coach that's the problem or, frankly, it's the club that's the problem, Manu, because, we're not talking about a club here that's firing all cylinders, that's put together an outstanding squad of players, and the head coach just can't get the best out of them. You look at that team that played against Werder Bremen, and with all due respect, I don't think that's a good Bundesliga side. There's still some decent players in there. Riet's a good player. Hacks had his day. Machino obviously did all right at Heidenheim last season. But it's a team, it's a club that has for a while now hoped to kind of get by on picking up players from below them in the Bundesliga table. They obviously picked up Shuto Makino from Holstein Kiel, Jens Kastrup they picked up from Nuremberg last season. Before that, Kleindienst and Kevin Stoger obviously picked up from Heidenheim and Bochum, respectively. There's nothing really kind of inspiring about the players that they pick up, the transfer dealings they have. There's a whole thing about, the sporting director and Verkus, who you mentioned, who was the one who made those comments about Seoane. He obviously stepped in to replace Max Eberl as well when he moved to RB Leipzig, if my memory serves me right. But there was a whole thing about that as to who was actually going to lead the club forward, because they've just been it feels like Gladbach have just been kind of rudderless for years now. And they're just kind of waiting for someone to kind of put them down, to be perfectly honest with you. And this is kind of where I really kind of struggle to kind of decide whether this is a club that are held back by Gerardo Seoane, or if it's Gerardo Seoane held back by this club, because I actually did some digging before we came on here, and I've got some stats which I think are pretty crazy. I'll list some of the players that the club have sold, Manu, since Seoane came in. Jonas Hoffmann, Lars Stindl, Rami Benzbayini, Marcus Thuram, Manu Kone, Ko Itakura, Julian Weigl, and Alison Player. Now, two or three of those guys maybe not up to scratch, but for the most part, a lot of them are really good Bundesliga players. Even like Rami Benzbayini, who, a bit of a laughing stock maybe at times for Dortmund, although I think he's actually done really well, I think, under Kovac. Outstanding player for Gladbach. Most of those players were outstanding players for Gladbach. And time again, Gladbach sell these players and they just do not bring in replacements by any means. They're not bringing through young players. They're not scouting exciting young talents. They're just kind of hoping to get by on picking up players off clubs who've just got relegated or sitting in the second division. And I checked Transfermarkt before we came on as well. They're 11th in terms of good site. They're 11th among all Bundesliga teams for money spent on transfers since Seoane came in. But also, to be fair, since Seoane came in, his record, the club is 1.22 points per game. And in the Bundesliga, his average points per game is the 17th among all Bundesliga managers who've played in the league, who've played at least 20 league games in league since he joined Gladbach. So he's there. He's definitely not picking up the right results, Manu. He's definitely not doing a good enough job. My question is, who comes in, picks up the squad and does better? Because I just think the squad is a squad destined to battle relegation regardless of who's sitting in the touchline.
Yeah, I
mean, sitting in the dugout, sorry.
I think that the departures of Ko Itakura and Manu Kone are two that are really hard to compensate. I would say that, I look at this lineup against Werder Bremen, and I looked at also some of the stats, like the XG in this game was 1.51 to 2.13. It wasn't like the 4-0 result was as predicated as people think. But okay, so Machino, he was a really good player for Kiel last year, right?
Yeah.
Reina, okay, well, we don't know. The talent is 100% there, we know it. Unfortunately, you also buy his family and everything that comes with it. That's just how it is. But there's a good player there. They have Philip Sander. Okay, probably not much better than a decent player, but Rocco Reitz, he's a guy that a lot of Bundesliga teams would like to have. Ulrich is considered a very talented left back. A talent though. Before we have to keep that in mind. Girodia, he came in from Werder Bremen. He was one of those players that Bremen didn't think Ole Werner furthered enough, right? Okay, maybe not ready for the Bundesliga yet. Elvedi, without a doubt, a good centre back, right? And then of course Scally would be the normal right back. He wasn't Kevin Dix. Yeah, and maybe not in this inspiring. And then the goalkeeper, Nicolas, the goalkeeping position at Gladbach has been a disaster ever since Jan Sommer left. So, I go through that and I see potential, but I also don't know. It's a lot of question marks, isn't it? It's like a lot of maybes and ifs and buts, and that's never a good sign. But that is how the squad is put together, and this feels similar to what happened at Leverkusen. There's also a coach who maybe is more interested in the technical sides of things and the tactical sides of things rather than squad building.
Yeah, I mean, we had a question from Michael in the chat saying, weren't Gladbach doing really well under Marco Rose and Max Eberl were involved in running the team? What has changed since then? I think the biggest change, I mean, the Rosa tenure ended in disaster because obviously he was courted by Dortmund and he basically tried to leave and the fans ended up hating him since then. They kind of finished at 8th, but
so bad.
I think Gladbach are definitely a kind of classic example of what happens to a club when they fall out of contention for European football, because all of a sudden their player squad, the budget for the playing squad halves. You really can't overstate the money that comes from playing even the Europa League, never mind the Champions League, which Gladbach used to be in. And every single summer, it seems to be this fire sale. They have to sell one of their big players to kind of keep the lights on. And I think the issue is that when Max Eberl was there, they were picking up young players every summer. Things were doing well on the pitch. They were obviously making a lot of money in Europe. Since he's moved on, and this is what point I'm making, they're not really picking up young players anymore. Tim Kleindienst is not a young player. Kevin Stoger is not a young player. These guys are players who are although I think Kleindienst obviously did a really good job at Gladbach, I think him and Kevin Stoger were perfect examples of Gladbach being like, let's sign these guys so we don't get relegated next season. That they're not signing these guys with the hope of selling them. I know technically, I think they actually tried.
I think Kleindienst is really missing at the moment.
Yeah, of course, and they actually did try and sign him the season before. To be fair, so I'm not saying, but I think I just think the transfer strategy has moved away from buying young players, developing good squads, making money in Europe, and repeating that to the guy who scouted and signed those players moved on to Leipzig. They lost a really good head coach, Marco Rosa. I know his stock's down right now, but he was doing really well at Gladbach at the time. Gerardo Seoane can't work miracles. The new sporting director, Verkus, can't, obviously scout and sign young players like Eberl can. So it's this kind of circle of doom in a sense where every summer every season they lose more and more money for not being in Europe, have to sell players, can't replace them, and that's why they just seem to be kind of sleepwalking towards relegation. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me, Manu, if they do kind of get dragged into it. But, there's still some decent players there, don't get me wrong. As you said, Kleindienst is kind of missing, so that's a big issue. But I don't know. I mean, I could totally understand why sacking Seoane makes sense, because he's obviously tried very hard to do something with the squad, and he just can't really do it for the most part. And maybe do need fresh eyes, no problem at this point, but I don't envy the next guy who's taking on that job, that's for sure.
Gladbach is a really good example of what happens when you are so reliant on Premier League money and the money stops coming in.
Yeah,
because Max Eberl had this cool system of finding these players and then sell them on for the Premier League, and he's really good at he was really good at the art of the deal of selling players early and then selling these players in May and June, and then bringing in new players right away. Something that somehow got forgotten at Bayern, but that's a different story entirely. And he then showed that at Leipzig as well, and it's just he has kind of forgotten it, but Gladbach have kind of forgotten it too. And it's a really big kind of danger when you are so reliant on that strategy and the strategy isn't working anymore, or the football or the world of football has just moved on. And so you have to reinvent yourself, and that's where they kind of stuck in right now, I think, a little bit. And I guess we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. But yeah, I think if you're a Gladbach fan, you have rightfully to be worried.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens. Maybe they can bounce back. Maybe they can bring in someone who can maybe start bringing some of the younger kids through at Gladbach. But yeah, it's worrying signs for now. But look, we're only 3 match days in, Manu, so we'll see what happens.
Exactly. Don't look at the table until match day 10. All right, Stefan. Yeah, as I mentioned already, show notes. This upcoming week, we're going to do our usual 2 bonus shows, but because the UEFA do this first Champions League match day over 3 days, our plan actually this season was to just do 1 bonus show per Champions League match day, right? Do them all 4 at once. But because they're spread over 3 games, we're gonna do 2 bonus shows on the 4 German teams. So we're gonna have one on Wednesday on the Bayern and Dortmund game, and then on Thursday Leverkusen and Frankfurt. So just wanted to shout that out in case you are wondering. And we're probably gonna be asked anyways why the bonus shows aren't where they are.
Yeah, and we keep getting comments, especially on YouTube, people asking like, are you guys going to talk about this club? You're going to talk about this club? And I keep responding saying, yeah, we did on the main show. So a lot of the videos you see on our YouTube channel are clips from the podcasts that are behind the paywall for members. So you can get them on YouTube and become a member of the show, or you can get them on the Substack if you become a subscriber. As you said, 2 bonus shows a week. And this week we'll be doing the Champions League roundups.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you get at minimum 3 articles a week on the Substack as well. It's usually more, right? We had like 2 extra ones this week because Matt Ford did something on Schalke. All right, let's wrap this up. We'll be back later this week with the Champions League football. And until then,